Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank firstly the General, the two associations, ADFA and Nick Floyd, for this opportunity, which has been the first myself in many years. I'd like to also say at the outset that I'm indebted to the presenters from the first seminar and in fact my three immediately preceding speakers who have given me much assistance and much information for what I'm going to present to you tonight. And I'd like to present what I'm going to say more as a discussion point rather than anything authoritative like perhaps Reece and the Professor has been able to give to you. I've been unable to access unit diaries. But nonetheless, we'll be bold. So, bottom line up front. Firstly, at Gallipoli, and indeed in the first half of the war, we see a watershed moment for the artillery, particularly the Royal Artillery, transitioning from being an infantry support weapon designed to smash infantry tactics, squares, columns, linear frontal assaults, etc., or thwart the cavalry as they tried to do something similar. And it transforms into what we would understand as a modern battlefield operating system in its own right. And then secondly, counter-battery fire, as we know it as modern gunners, essentially did not exist at this point. We'd seen definitely artillery on artillery engagements for many years, sometimes even centuries. But as Major Darryl Kelly highlighted us in the first seminar, there were engagements, and he gave us two illustrations, and the Australian gunners came off second best in both those engagements. But I would put it to you that those engagements represent more of an artillery duel rather than what we would understand as counter-battery fire. So, for what I'm going to present to you tonight, 1415 is the end of an era. This late 15 is a watershed moment, and we see a revolution that comes about in 1916 and later on the war. And artillery transforms itself into much more of what we would recognise as modern-day gunners. I would also, as part of this proposition, present to you a distinction which is not so obvious now, but was quite strong in those days, and that is the distinction between garrison, field and horse artillery. Now, while there might have been some interplay of the officers and things like that, they were assigned very specific roles, and in the case of the horse artillery, viewed themselves as something as an entirely separate entity. By the end of the war, we see those differences distinctly breaking down, and the Royal Artillery as a whole has been transformed. Right, I'll begin with the defence of my position with a quick overrun of indirect fire. Indirect fire being an essential element of what we understand to be counter-battery fire. Now, in 1915, the indirect method of firing artillery, especially the British Army, was still somewhat of a novelty. We'd seen it in a limited manner beforehand, and in fact, even at Waterloo, some Royal Horse chaps had fired some shrapnel in defence of the Hougoumont. But it was still somewhat a novelty. A Russian had produced a book in 1882, and from what I can understand, the first to translate that were the Germans. It was quite some years before the British did the same. By the 1880s, the Germans had actually invented a sight that, combined with clinometers, allowed them to fire in the indirect method. By the 1890s, it was doctrine in the German army. Now, the British had played half-heartedly with this idea, but hadn't really adopted it, hadn't really got behind the idea. Nonetheless, they were still the first to use it in operations against the Boers. They had to do so without that sight, or in a sight equivalent to what the Germans had, particularly the optical sight. So, by the beginning of the 20th century, the chief exponents of the indirect method are the Germans and the Russians. To make an obvious statement, who were the military advisors to the Ottomans? It was the Germans. The Ordnance Board, which had met following the Boer War, sent into production such systems as the 18-pounder and the 4.5 howitzer. But the howitzer in far fewer numbers. The ratio was about 3-1 in favour of the guns. French 75 was a product of their experience of the Franco-Prussian War, when they'd been decidedly outgunned and outmanoeuvred by the Germans. Nonetheless, the novelty of the indirect fire is possibly captured in one estimate by the French of about 75,000 French soldiers becoming casualties of their own artillery, the bulk of this occurring earlier on in the war. Quick look at the geography. The peninsula runs roughly southwesterly, ends in the Aegean. Up towards the north, the narrowest part, it's about 6.5 kilometres wide, not very large. It's roughly 77 kilometres long. The area was designated a fortified area. This was apparently a well-known fact. Now, I, as a military planner, and I would consider myself such, have a distinct preference for avoiding such things designated as fortified, unless some extenuating senses force me to go that way. At Anzac Cove, names such as Baby 700, 400 Plateau, Hill 971, give us a bit of an idea of the heights that were to be encountered. The beach itself, quite small, 600 metres long, and always within 1 kilometre of the front. That's your main supply point. So we're talking about a very compact, steeply sloping battlefield, and the advantage is always going to be with those possessing the heights, where they can rain down indirect plunging fire on you, and all your movements are open to observation. Our guns, on the other hand, the 18-pounders and the 75s, particularly the 18-pounders, having problems with firing at elevations. We've already seen a few examples of that, where you've got to dig the trails in just to get any sort of useful elevation and fire up these rather impressive features. If you miss, the round flies harmlessly off into the waters beyond. So the Turkish need only to put their guns in defilade, and they have the advantage. Now, one more map. What I've been able to gather, the shortest point up around running from Anzac across to Lagos.
Our question.
Nice question.
Yeah, minus is below. Our question is that small cove. That is our question.
The distance is roughly about 7 kilometres. So you're talking about a very narrow piece of terrain, a very hilly piece of terrain. And to state the obvious once again, the heavy calibre guns, particularly of the naval division, is going to be a bit of a problem with their flat trajectories, etc. Equipment. I'll leave that one. All right, the Turkish artillery. I'll very, very quickly skim through this because we've just had a presentation on that. Needless to say, we've got the 75s, and if you want to have a look at a good piece of Turkish artillery, pop yourself down to the gun gates, where we've got 2 examples brought home after the war. Just for interest's sake, the gun on the bottom left is the Krupp 6-pounder, introduced into service in 1868 and was the system that smashed the French in the Franco-Prussian War. And I think even to the casual observer, you can see that the heavy design influences from that system to what resulted the French 75. Our equipment. As I've said before, the French 75 and the 18-pounders were derived from their respective experiences, the Franco-Prussian War and the Boer War, as well as studies of the American Civil War. 75, I've already said, mimicked the successful German designs. One can imagine the French experience of 1870 and then repeated again in 1914 of German infantry columns, regimental and battalion size, attempting to outflank the larger French formations, or the cavalry divisions trying to do the same. These outflanking tactics reinforcing the British experience of what they had seen in the Boer War and the expert Boer cavalrymen. These guns, with their shrapnel rounds, could theoretically lay down a withering and devastating fire. So we've proven the concept. We bought the equipment, it's all working well. At the beginning of the Great War, the British guns were equipped exclusively with shrapnel rounds. But as I've said already, with the ratio being 3 to 1 in terms of field guns and howitzers. Turning quickly just to the ammunition. Well, I've got Darryl Kelly's given me a couple of examples, which obviously impossible to see from this distance, but I'll bring up to you later on. About 1 inch in size, naval shrapnel. About 1/2 inch in size, smaller than your average glass marble, the 18-pounder shell. The 18-pounder shrapnel. 375 of those little bad boys in every round. Oh, bullets. The round used a time fuse designed to function in front of the target and could essentially move those 375 balls 300 metres from the point of burst. So some mathematics for you. At a theoretical rate, 20 rounds a minute, single guns laying down 7,480 bullets per minute. A pair of guns, nearly 15,000 rounds. 4-gun detachment, battery, troop, whatever you want to call it, nearly 30,000 rounds per minute. And these are not my calculations. They are, from what I've been able to discover, part of the basis upon which these systems were developed. So these are not my calculations of 2 weeks ago. They are calculations of over 100 years ago. Gunners at the time became very expert at placing their guns, closely supporting the fire and movement tactics of the infantry, and laying down this accurate and withering shrapnel fire. But what happens when the infantry, the opposing artillery for that matter, do the next most obvious thing and dig in? Cavalry, of course, having departed for schnapps and medals. These shrapnel rounds are not so effective against heavy emplacements or against steel shells. Into the HE round. HE round was not trialled in operations until October 1914 by 70 Battery at the Ypres front. It was considered quite successful at destroying fortifications and killing troops. That was in late 1914. Over at Gallipoli, the poorest second cousin, the second front, or the third if you're throwing the conflict against Russia, you're not going to get the priority of effort that Western and Eastern Europe is demanding. So the major lesson learned from 1914 was the doctrine of placing these guns in the open or in semi-exposed positions made them incredibly vulnerable, particularly to artillery fire, particularly to artillery direct fire. The artillery duel, as I've spoken about before. So more use was made of sheltered positions, as General Stevens highlighted. Therefore, the forward observer and the artillery observer, the air observer, becomes quite essential. I'll wrap it up now, sir. Looking at, particularly at counter-battery fire at Gallipoli. And I've only just raised this map again to show you, to reacquaint you with the compactness of the position. Particularly at Lone Pine, the counter-battery role was assigned to this old lady, the Bacante. Sorry if I butchered the pronunciation. There's 2 9-inch guns and a bunch of 6-inch guns, 14 and 16 kilometre ranges. But as Commander Stevens at the first firepower seminar told us, getting the guns onto target, staying on target, and then having an effect given their low trajectory was incredibly difficult and very, very rudimentary for the time. The Royal Navy's reluctant to get in close. They've already lost 5 battleships and 1,500 soldiers. And these issues are still what we deal with in naval gunnery. So, just bringing it all into conclusion. In the middle of the 18th century, the 19th century, we see artillery being used as a small as support to the infantry weapon. By the end of the war, it has become a battlefield operating system in its own right, and has, in fact, in terms of sheer numbers of manpower, supplanted that previous super weapon, the Royal Navy. The Royal Artillery outnumbering the Royal Navy by the end of the war. And I've lost the last page. Too many guns, too few howitzers, and rudimentary